Let me tell you about our speaker today. Dr. Karen Neal is a performance storyteller and affiliate professor at Florida Atlantic University, where she teaches classes in storytelling studies for the School of Communication and Multimedia Studies. Dr. Neal has appeared and published throughout the country and abroad, including as a university instructor at Warsaw and a Fulbright senior specialist in universities in Jerusalem and Vienna. She is the former chair of the National Storytelling Network and was the co-founding editor of the international academic journal Storytelling Self-Society, published by Wayne State University. Dr. Neal co-hosts The Public Storyteller, a weekly programming on South Florida Public Radio, WLRN 91.3 FM. Her numerous publications include the book, The Great American Story, and you're going to love this, the forthcoming book, Florida Lore. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neal.
How's everybody doing? My dad was stationed during World War II for part of that time in Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And there came a time in this young soldier's life when he and a friend were given a 24-hour pass and needed a little R&R. So they hitched a ride, and then they hitched another ride. They were going to a lake, maybe an hour's journey away from the camp. Now, my father told me this story when we were on I-95. One day, he'd come to visit. He and my mother had come down here to visit, and he saw a flatbed truck hauling a boat. So they were hitching ride after ride, and at one point, a flatbed truck hitching a boat stopped for them, pulling a boat stopped for them, and they went up to the cab, and the driver went like that. So they went into the bed, and the driver went like that. So they sat in the boat on the trailer as they were going down to the lake. But that's not the end of the story. When they got off and thanked the driver, my father's friend looked at him and doubled over in laughter and said, "Sid, your face," and couldn't stop laughing. Well, my father, I guess he went over to a parked car and looked in the mirror, the side mirror, and he saw that his face was completely speckled with red and brown dots. Anybody want to take a guess what those red and brown dots were? Anybody want to take a guess? Sorry? Could have been measles, could have been bug bites. Very good guesses, but no. Could have been what? Makes perfect sense, mud from the truck tires. No, I'll give you a hint. My father was sitting on the driver's side of the boat. The driver was spitting tobacco into the wind, and it all hit my father's face. Now you can imagine, this is a very memorable family story for me. And I wanted to start off with that story. And I will tell you a little bit later, probably, another family story, one or two family stories related to my dad. Family stories are quite literally what make us who we are. Yes, we are composed of so much water and so much calcium and so much this and that, iron, etc. But really, who we are is a product of all of those stories we lived through and we heard. Now, the book that I did, The Great American Story, based on my dissertation, was based on about 60 family stories I collected from all over the country. And what I was looking for at that time was the American values that are still present and obvious within those family stories. The reason I was looking for that in family stories was because we as a nation don't tell that many folk tales anymore. The book that you heard mentioned that is coming out in December, those are folk tales and legends and myths, and we know them, but really the stories we tell day to day are either about what we went through. I'm going to give you a handout. What we went through ourselves, which are called personal memories. Sorry, I don't have any more. Or what, I'll give you one later. Or what our family members or our friends went through. And when we tell these stories, when we think of these stories, the values that are expressed are reinforced. Now, for me, one of the values of my family that was reinforced in that story was a sense of humor. My father had a really good sense of humor. He was always making jokes, and he thought this was just hilarious that he had this tobacco all over his face. Which will lead me to the other story when he was in the Army. He was at Fort Dix before he was at Fort Bragg, and he was about 19, 20 years old, and he found out that if he jumped out of a plane with a parachute, if he was a paratrooper, he would make a couple more bucks. And like he'd make $21 a month instead of 19 or something like that. And he thought this was great because he was a young man. He wanted to make as much money as he could. Now, Fort Dix is in New Jersey. His parents lived in New Jersey, which is, I guess, why he was there first. So he wrote his parents a letter, nice boy that he was. He wrote him a letter and said, "You're going to be very proud of me. I am moving up in the world. I am going to be a paratrooper, and I'm going to make more money." 2 days later, my grandfather took the train from his hometown, Trenton, to Fort Dix to tell my father the message that my grandmother had given him. She said, "If you jump out of a plane with a parachute, I will jump off our roof with an umbrella." Needless to say, my father did not become a paratrooper. Now, these stories tell me they loved each other, they cared about each other, they wanted to get ahead. He was taught to want to get ahead, make a couple of more bucks, even if it involved jumping out of a plane. But also, as I said, about this sense of humor. Now, some of this, because I've studied family stories, some of this I have written down and thought about, and it's very conscious. But there are so many other values that are unconscious in people's stories, right? And there are so many stories that we have not yet heard. So I have made it my mission, and I am so delighted that I was invited here today, and I am so impressed with you that all of you recognize how important this subject is. Some of it, a lot of it is not brain surgery, but some of it, or rocket science, but some of it you may just not have thought of, right? Like, why do this at all? Well, I think you can answer that. Why are you here, ma'am? Why are you interested in family stories?
Because we're going to have a family reunion here on the 26th. and we want to have people tell their stories.
Everybody hear that? She's going to have a family reunion here on the 26th and wants people to tell their stories. Perfect reason, perfect reason. Do you have a particular reason for being here today?
Well, I want to make sure these stories are not lost in time. I wanted to pass it on down.
Wants to pass down the stories, make sure they're not lost. Absolutely. Now, we are standing in a history center or sitting in this history center, so I want to be very clear. First thing I want to tell you about family stories is they are stories. Collecting family history, oral histories, is a different thing. And we're going to talk about both of these things. And you'll get a chance to figure out which it is you're interested in. Maybe you're interested in both. What are the differences? And we'll leave room for questions at 1 o'clock. So you'll have a lot of chance. And if there's something burning you have to ask before and you have to leave at 1, I understand. Just let me know. So, the most interesting factoid about stories is that storytelling's stock in trade, the most important thing about storytelling, is not the facts. The most important thing about storytelling is the feeling. It is said that the reason writing was developed in the first place, anybody know why was writing developed? We had storytellers, we had shamans, we had all kinds of ways of passing down history. Anybody have a thought as to why writing was developed? Or when writing was developed? I don't mean the year, but what was happening in history? Exactly. Do you know how long I've been doing this? And you are the only person who has ever answered that. Let's give this woman a hand. Exactly. Exactly right. I'm sorry. I was about to say this. It was trade. The reason was commerce. That would have been pretty funny if I'd had you give her a hand and said, you're the only one who got it right, and then nobody knew what she said. That would have been a very, very sad thing. So thank you for saying that. So, when the hunters went out and killed the buffalo, whether they killed 11 or 12 wasn't as important as the bravery of the hunters, the camaraderie of the hunters. Did one person save somebody's life? Did one person run faster than another? It didn't matter the miles per hour. What mattered was the experience and how the experience made people feel. But once people were trading buffalo hides for sheaves of grain or wheat, whatever, then we needed to know exactly, right? We couldn't just kind of estimate. That isn't to say that the word story means that this isn't true. A story can be true, certainly, but it means that the truth of the story with a small t, that is the, I swear, we're around a courtroom, we're in a courtroom, aren't we? I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That part of it is not as important as, because it gets forgotten in a game of telephone throughout the years, right? It's not as important as what does the story tell us about what it is to be human, about what it is to be a member of our family. That is not the same as an oral history. So that's why I'm making that distinction, okay? Now, this is the culminating culminating presentation in your How We Work series that's here, that has been here. How many people got to see that, by the way? Good, great, I'm glad. And so I want to be sure to tie in, because it's a very easy tie-in to make, very obvious, work and family. The most time we are said to spend during any given day is probably at work with our coworkers, right? But during the weekend and in the evenings. Hopefully, we're spending a lot of our time with our family. These are really the two most important experiences for most people, right? And I told you stories about my father's army work, and I'll tell you about the other stuff too. So, when you are collecting stories about work, for example, it is useful to know how much somebody made an hour, perhaps, or a year, perhaps. For a historian, it's extremely useful. For a storyteller, maybe what's more important is how the person was treated, how the person felt about his or her job, took pride in it, didn't, etc., identified with the job, etc. Okay? So that's the distinction I'm making. Now I want to say one word about, one little bit about storytelling. I do not own the rights to that word, neither does the National Storytelling Network, of which I was once chair, that is the professional and enthusiast organization of storytellers. Used to be based in Tennessee, now it's based in Kansas City. I will not say any of us are the gatekeepers of that word. But what I am here to talk to you about specifically is not writing down the stories. What you want to do with the stories after you collect them is your business. You might want to write them down. But I will tell you an apocryphal, probably didn't happen, but a great story about storytelling that will help you understand why when I talk about storytelling, I mean the oral tradition, and that's why things may get forgotten a little bit, details along the way. It is said that there was a town in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, that thought, how could we preserve our history? How could we be absolutely certain that nobody forgets what happened in this town? If, heaven forbid, there is a nuclear war or there is some disaster, we want to be sure that our town's history and stories are preserved. What do we do? So they thought of a time capsule. No, we don't want to put a time capsule. What if the building's obliterated, or what if the ground is ripped up, or what? So they went on and on and on, and they decided the best way to do it was to bring together 10 10-year-olds and tell them the story. And if there were people left, which of course you would need, then each of those 10 10-year-olds would grow up and tell 10 more 10-year-olds. And people would keep the story alive. And I have seen this with many groups that I've worked with. I've said, yeah, you can write a book and that's great. Chances are the book will be on the library shelf or on the books, or they'll buy it, but they'll put it on the shelf. But sitting at a reunion or being at a Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas or anything else, keeping those stories alive by looking in somebody's eyes, by having that, storytelling is often called the theater of the face, by having somebody see my energy and my smile and all the things that make a story come alive, that is going to excite people and help people remember and help people pass on the story. If I get a strong emotion when I hear a story or read a story, I am more likely to remember. And emotion is passed along more easily when it is a face-to-face or human connection. I'm not saying we don't feel emotions through writing. Look, I write all the time. That's how I was first trained as a writer. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you're not a writer, it is really irrelevant to what we're talking about today. Okay? I'm going to stop right here for a second. Are there any pressing, burning questions? So what I'm talking about here is the oral narrative tradition. Now, I brought a book because we were talking a little bit about work. I brought a book that is one of the great, in fact, probably the first and maybe still the greatest compilations of oral history on work, and that is Terkel's 1974, I think it was, book called Working, and where he collected dozens and dozens of people's memories of work. It is a fascinating, wonderful book, but I looked through it to find a good representative story, and it reminded me very strongly about the difference between storytelling and oral history. Now, I was trained in both, so I'll give you very clearly the differences. I think they are both terrific, but I think they serve very different purposes. If I am collecting family stories, which I did during the time I was collecting these stories for my research, I was at conferences and visiting all over the country, and I would be at a party, or I would be sometimes at a train station, and I would start talking to somebody, and I would say, do you have any family stories? Now, at the time, I know this is hard to believe, there were no cell phones. I couldn't record so easily, but I carried around a little recorder, and I did record and transcribe these stories word for word. But if I were to tell these stories, as I do with my own family stories, the words are not as important as the what is this story about, right? Why do I remember this story? Why did my father remember this story? Why am I telling this story? In the same way, the facts aren't as important. When I've done oral histories, that is a legitimate, recognized, and very well respected form of history work, right? So I arrange an interview with somebody. I ask them questions ahead of time to be able to do a little research on their experiences. For one thing, I would have known the name of that lake and how far my father had to hitch, and I would have gotten specifics about a lot more about Fort Bragg, et cetera, et cetera. But I wouldn't have necessarily assumed that the person from whom I was getting the oral history knew all of this. So I would prepare questions in advance to interview the person with some knowledge ahead of time on what questions I needed to ask. Especially as World War II veterans get older, I would need to not assume that they necessarily remember every detail. But we don't remember every detail of our childhoods either, right? If it's you're the story side, you're the history side. If it's a story, it's fine if they don't remember the exact name of the, did you need to know the exact name of the lake to enjoy the story? No. If it's history, absolutely that's important. And if the person doesn't know, then when if I know that this is coming up about a lake, I will do the research ahead of time and say it was such and such a lake. Do you remember that? Or afterwards, during the editing phase, I will put in brackets, not part of the transcription, but in the middle of the transcription or as a footnote, I will say it was lake such and such. Anybody know what lake it was, by the way? You see, it doesn't matter. All right? If I'm doing oral history, I'm putting it in a book, most likely, or I'm putting it I'm printing it, I am editing it, I'm bringing it back to my, what we call informant, and I am asking the informant, is this correct? Did I get this right? If somebody's language, that might be something of their slang or something they say might embarrass them a little bit, I might make a little change. If somebody coughs, I might keep that in the raw text, because maybe a cough is important. Maybe a cough means that they were nervous, or maybe a cough means that they may have forgotten something. If I am collecting a story, it's not relevant, because stories are made to be told over and over and over again. The operative word here is told. There is no original version that we have to go back to. My father didn't that very day write down exactly what happened. He remembered it 40, 50 years later that it happened. Another thing about storytelling that's so interesting is that people's memory works differently at different times, right? So if we pull out a story over and over again to tell, based on how old we are, based on our other experiences, not to mention based on whom we're talking to, we're going to remember different things. That story's going to come out differently. That's the beauty of storytelling. That is not what we want in oral history. In oral history, we want as close to the documentable, verifiable facts as we can get. Okay? So this is fabulous for people telling what they were making in 1974, or how many breaks they got or didn't get during a day, or what somebody said to them at work. But it's not a story. So that leads us to your sheets to remind you from maybe 5th grade, 4th grade, what is a story, and to add a little bit to that. A story has a beginning and a middle and an end. As you know, everybody pretty well remembers, I'm sure, that we've got the characters and the setting, time and place at the beginning, the middle, and this part, I think, makes people a little bit concerned. And if you can't see this, you've got this on your page. We have a problem. That word makes people worried. Some people call that a crisis or a conflicting action. Some linguists call it that. All it means is there's something propelling the story, an itch that needs to be scratched, a question that needs to be answered, a quest that needs to be resolved, right? It doesn't necessarily mean a problem. So my father's problem was, you could say it was how to get to the lake, but I'm going to say really the crux of the story was, what was it on his face, right? And that becomes our problem as well. We need to identify with the person in the story in one way or another. We may think he's an idiot, but we need to in some way relate to him because none of us is perfect all the time, right? So then the most interesting part that we really don't learn about in school, and when you're thinking about your family stories, if you think you have none, if you think, oh, I've got too many, how do I choose? The most interesting part to me is the end part of beginning, middle, and end. And that part is not only solving the problem, which is what we learn in 5th grade. I need milk to feed my baby this morning, but if and I go to the store and before work and the store is closed, and if I go to the other store, I'm going to be late for work, and I've been late for work already 3 times this week, so what am I going to do? There's a problem. Right? We care about this problem theoretically. What am I going to do? If I drive to the next next door, and get the milk, and I'm late for work, all right, it happened, but would you remember that? Would that be memorable? Would that be, maybe I got fired, then it becomes memorable, right? Like you care, right? You've got an emotion. But what if this has happened before, and that's why I've been late to work, and it's happened again and again. Why do I remember this time? Because this time I kicked in the door, and I reached inside, and I pulled a glass of milk, a bottle of milk, or a container of milk from the refrigerator, and I ran out. Well, you're going to remember that, right? And that shows you something about me, and it's a surprise. It's something, by the way, that never happened, I just want to tell you. It's just an example. I know I'm in a court of law. It never happened. So the idea is, why am I telling this story? With oral history, with this book about working, it was a work day and this is what happened. These are the facts. This is what color the courtroom was. And this was the temperature. And there were X number of people. Fine. That's important. That's what I call little t truth, the documentable, verifiable truth. But big T truth, the universal truths of human experience. What does this story tell me? The story tells me that I cared so much about my baby getting milk, and that I cared so much about not being late for work, and that I had to balance these two things, that I made a decision at that moment that the least important thing was what happened afterwards. I had to take care of this right now, right? We've all been in situations like that, where we had to balance out competing options, and we made a decision right away. And it tells you volumes about me. So, it's a solution to the problem, and it's a surprise. And the last part that I put down there is transformation. When you hear that story, you are in some way changed. Now, it might be you're changed in a very tiny amount. It might be, oh, well, now I know what I'm never, ever, ever going to do, because that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. Or it might be, I know a little bit more about what it is to be a mother. Or I know a little bit more about what it is to be a very hard-working person who can't afford to lose a job. I've never been in that experience. The me in the story, the person who did that in the story, was transformed also, because if I'm telling you that story really well, I'm going to show you perhaps that she never did this before in her life, she never so much as got a parking ticket, and now she's at a point of desperation where she does this thing she never thought she was capable of doing. So she was transformed a little bit. Why do we remember stories? Emotion. Why do we tell stories? One of the reasons is because when I tell you a story, you learn something about me personally, if it's about me, or if it's a story that I care to tell you, or if it's a story about my family. But a story does something else very beautiful. A story connects us in a way that oral history may or may not. Now, I'm not saying there are never stories in oral histories. I'm just saying that's not the point of oral history. But a story, you and I, let me ask you, I may be wrong. Was there anybody who did not see a young soldier, 19 or 20, with red spots on his face in your mind's eye when I told you that first story? Anybody not see that? It is said that 98% of the population, when we hear a story, visualize it. Use our sense of vision, of sight. 2%, they say, may use their sense of sound, their sense of smell. If I had really done this story right, I would have told you how hot it was, their sense of touch, etc. But most of us, the vast majority, use our mind's eye when we hear a story, which is why we say things like seeing is believing, and why most storytellers will give you a lot of visual and may forget about the other senses, because that sense is so strong in our culture. Not only in our species, but definitely in our culture. Okay. So when we have all seen this together, this young man in 1943, let's say, or 42, with red and brown spots on his face, by a lake, we have taken a journey together. We have experienced something together. Now, some of you may have taken day trips or trips with friends and you're not speaking to them anymore. It happens. But a lot of us, when we do something with another person, what does it do? It connects us. We've had the same experience. You have seen through my eyes. Now, if I told you the circumference of the lake, the temperature at the time, etc., and my father had speckles, and that was it, and didn't tell you the whole story. My father had speckles because somebody spat tobacco in his face. That's different from our living that story, getting that little emotion, that smiling laughter or whatever that you may have experienced from finding out what it was, and that little surprise, we were there together. And if the story had taken more than 30 seconds to a minute to tell you, we would have really been there together. Now, when it comes to your reunion, and I hope you'll send me a card. People don't do that anymore. I hope you'll email me. When it comes to your reunion, when it comes to Thanksgiving dinner, when it comes to Sunday supper, whatever it is, when you're sharing those stories, it is a vertical sharing, generation to generation. It is a horizontal sharing across generations. Now, I have a little prize here. I wish I could have given you a brand new one before the end of this session, before 1 o'clock. I am going to give this to one very lucky person. And it is a copy, an extra copy that I had, and my books are all used, so yours is no worse than mine, of a wonderful book about family storytelling called Black Sheep and Kissing Cousins. Great title, isn't it? It's a very readable, really fun book. It's on the back of your sheet. I gave you a bibliography, a few examples of interesting things. There is a lot of interest, not just as evidenced by this room, but there's a lot of interest in family stories for many obvious reasons I don't have to go into with you, but perhaps the greatest is why there's a lot of interest in storytelling in general today. And that is because so many of us live our lives with our thumb or our forefinger looking down at a screen. And it is perfectly understandable that we do this. I do it too, but there is nothing like that face-to-face interaction. May I do an experiment? May I do an experiment with you? Yes. Will you say as many times as you can to me, yes? No, just once. I'm sorry. Excuse me. I didn't say the whole thing yet. I took a breath. That was beautiful. Give her applause. Only say it once at a time, but we're going to go back and forth. You're going to say it as many times as you can think of. That was the worst instruction anybody ever gave anybody. I apologize. You did exactly what I'd asked you to do, and I didn't mean to ask you to do that. In as many different ways as you can think of it, okay? So you might say yes, or you might say yes, or something else.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Excellent. Anything else? I got one. You're too nice. Yes! The way we say things. Thank you very much. Give her another hand, please. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for that. The way we say things, the way our faces look, the way that what's called proxemics, how close we stand to somebody, all of this affects the story every bit as much as the words and the content. Not to mention, of course, our choice of words, right? I'd like you to look at these sample topics for family stories. When you are, and these can't come from another book in your bibliography by Stephen Zeitlin, called A Celebration of Family Storytelling, which unfortunately I think you can only get used now. This came out of his dissertation, and these are some of the suggestions he gave that are such fruitful prompts for family storytelling, right? And if you ask a simple, now this is not an interview, I'm over at the storytelling side. You're not interviewing somebody, you're saying, do you have any stories about? Were there any villains? Yes, there was a guy who stole all Aunt Sadie's money. Oh, okay, thanks. No, tell me about him. And then little by little by little, hopefully, if you've looked at the what makes a story, you can sort of help shape, or you can help shape the person's answers, or you can take those answers and shape them yourself into a family story, right? How did he what could his problem be? Well, how did he hide the money, or how did he get the money from her in the first place? And how did she react? And what did you hear that you would never have expected, etc.? they are also wonderful stories for oral histories of your family, right? In which case, you can ask questions, but you're not going to reshape the material into the beginning, middle, and end. You're just going to take down what the person said in answer to your questions, okay? Now, I also listed some sample topics for stories about work. And of course, you can conflate the two there, the family stories and the stories about work. And again, some people are natural storytellers who are going to, you don't have to pull out of them these questions for your beginning and middle and end to be able to share these stories with the next generation. But some people, you may need to prompt them a little bit with oral histories, if you want to do an oral history of your workplace or of the work people in your family did, or a particular job somebody in your family had, then these may be important places to start, but you're going to want to do some research ahead of time so that you can ask questions, or you can make a little edit. Let's say it was not a lake at all. Maybe there was no lake there at all. So then when I come to the person, I'm going to say, I couldn't find my father. I'm going to say, I couldn't find a lake. Could it have been somewhere else you're going, right? If it's a family story, it doesn't matter whether it was a lake or a river. If it's an oral history, we may want a little bit more information, so we want to come prepared like any journalist would or any historian would certainly do that, okay? So we have just a couple more minutes. Anybody who is leaving at 1 have a question or a comment? Okay, good. Then I think I'm going to do 2 things. One, I always loved in Let's Make a Deal when Monty asked people what they had in their pockets. And people would come up with the funniest things. So I'm going to say the first person who can hold up a red pen. Oh, that was really tough. I'm sorry, I saw this one first. It may be because the 2 of you are a little further back. This was the first one I saw. But 3 of you held it up. It was just about the same time. So to be fair, the 3 of you who held it up, I'm thinking of a number from 1 to 10. Sorry? Oh, you too? You too? I'm sorry, sir. Okay, 9. It was number 1. And you know what? It was meant to be because I saw her first anyway. Okay, enjoy it, enjoy it. And I want to end with a family story, and one other one that ties together family and work. My father had 4 jobs when I was growing up. His main job was as a junior high school, now we call middle school, of course, art teacher. His summer job was as an art teacher in a day camp. His Saturday job was teaching art classes in our basement. And then a couple of times a week, he sold men's clothing downtown in the little town we lived in. Now, none of those jobs, unless I was an artist, which I was not, gave any perks to his kids, right? I couldn't go to the family restaurant and take my friends and have free milkshakes. I couldn't get a summer job as a high school student at any of his places. It was just no fun being the child of somebody with these, and I didn't wear men's clothing anyway. So being the child of a father with these 4 jobs. And then all of a sudden, the other day, when I was thinking about this program, it occurred to me there was one perk. When I was 5 years old, my father's friend at the school, who was the drama teacher, was putting on Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. So the kids were performing A Christmas Carol. They were high school kids. They didn't have anybody small enough to play Tiny Tim. right? So in the shop department, my father's friend in the shop department made me a little crutch because, of course, Tiny Tim has a crutch. And I was not expected to be on stage for any of the rest of the show. I don't know how they wrote me out of the rest of the show. But at the very last minute, my father handed me the crutch, which of course I carried on stage. My father handed me the crutch and gave me a little boost. And I walked onto stage and said, God bless us, everyone. And ladies and gentlemen, I think that that perk could be why I am standing here in front of you today. That is my favorite family work story. Now, if you need to leave, nobody will be offended. I am so grateful that you were able to spend your lunch hour with us. For the rest of you, we'll take a moment for people who need to go. Thank you so much for coming. For the rest of you, if you've got comments, questions, if you want a card, whatever you need, I'll be here for a few more, as long as you need, actually. So, did I see a hand over here? Any comments, questions? Ma'am. Okay, I will repeat your question then.
My father died in the 40s, age of 80.
Her father died in the 1940s at the age of 80.
All of a sudden want to write about him.
She wants to write about him now.
Is it a oral history? I will include stories.
All right, well, first,
Spirits.
is it an oral history? Well, I hope that I didn't mislead you when I gave the storytelling side of the room and the oral history side of the room, because certainly you can include stories in an oral history, but somebody needs to tell you the story. The idea of an oral history, and correct me on any of this that I get wrong, is that you are taking down somebody's exact words. Now, your father, unfortunately, is not going to tell you what happened to him, but other people around him might. So if they are telling you what they know about your father, you could be taking oral histories of people talking about your father, and this is what you've got down, and this is exactly how they said it. Do you want to write a book about this? Do you want to just collect these stories and know them for yourself? Then whatever you get, whether you're interviewing people or you're getting stories, is all gold. Right? So I don't want you to be concerned, what do I call this? For your purposes. Whatever you get, whatever information you get is wonderful. And your children and children's children and et cetera will be very grateful for it. Collecting pictures, material culture, which is, you know, the handkerchief or the shoes or the tie or the medals or whatever, and the stories, whatever you get is wonderful and priceless, and don't wait another minute. Did that help? Okay, so you don't have to worry if you've got things down verbatim. And you may not worry about checking facts if it's just for your own pleasure. If you want to check the facts, you certainly are in the right place to do that. Okay? Great question. Anybody else have a comment or a question? Yes, sir.
In the Great Depression, they sent writers out, mainly to
The WPA, right.
and they interviewed slaves and stuff like that. Is that going on now? I mean, does anybody gather oral history?
Great question that I cut you off on. Does anybody gather their oral histories?
Is that going on now? And who does that? Who pays for it?
Great question. Are people still doing what they did in the Federal Writers Works Progress Administration? That's what it's called, right? What they did was the Federal Writers Project, where they sent people out to collect these stories from people, these oral histories, oral histories. They are doing it as we speak. People are doing this. First of all, historians are doing it. as a matter of course, because in the 60s there was a movement that started about around the 60s called social history, where suddenly people realized historians have been interviewing generals, we've been interviewing politicians, we've been interviewing the elite. Why don't we interview midwives? Why don't we interview storekeepers? Why don't we interview people who've lived these lives, not only the famous people, right, or the people who are in power? So oral historians have been collecting stories from a vast untapped source, collecting oral histories, excuse me, from a vast untapped source since the 60s, and that's still very much going on. So people are doing it for doctoral work, for writing books, etc. 9/11. There was a huge movement during 9/11 to collect the oral histories of people who lived through that experience. As well as in Louisiana, New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, people collected those stories. There is more and more of an emphasis on that work, thanks to, in large part, Studs Terkel, who popularized this, but also before that, thanks to these historians in the 60s who realized how important this was. So people do get grants. I have gotten grants for this kind of work. In fact, I am just finishing up the application for a grant collecting stories of impoverished people in my community, to understand what it's like to be working poor and how they got there and what their experience is. I don't know if I'm going to get the grant for it, but it's possible. So people are definitely doing this, very much alive. And there are oral history archives. When I was trained to do this at FAU, as a graduate student at FAU, at the time they were putting together an archive, a Florida history archive, and also a World War II archive, because FAU's Boca campus used to be an army base. They invented radar there, and so they wanted to collect the World War II stories of people in the town. So we were getting oral histories. Yeah, great question. Anybody else? Thank you for coming. Yes?
One thing that might help people if they are looking for a way to pass information on to their grandchildren, we have 8. And for when they reach 16, I did a book for each one of them, Grandmother Remembers. And he did one, Grandfather Remembers. And they have really been effective because they have picked up things in those books. In fact, just an example was one time we were at our son's.
Excuse me, let me interrupt for a minute in case people can't hear. The Grandmother Remembers, Grandfather Remembers books, they filled them out with their memories for their 8 grandchildren.
We were at our oldest sons, and our granddaughter said, Grandma, sit down. I want you to listen to something. And she went to the computer, and she put on Glenn Miller playing In the Mood. She did not know who Glenn Miller was. She had never heard In the Mood, but I had put in the book that that was our song when we were dating. And so that's just an example.
Beautiful example. Her granddaughter got on the web the story In the Mood and played it for her, because in that book they had written that that was their song. And that's a great song to have be your song, by the way. So that kind of thing is exactly what we're talking about here. Now, you... I was going to say you're fortunate, but you're here today, so I'm sure these are values you pass down to your kids. Your kids care about this stuff, a lot. Your grandchildren. A lot of young people don't care so much. Am I right? Will you speak for all young people everywhere? Would you say that you're younger than 50, right?
I personally care, but everybody's different.
A lot of people don't. You're exactly right. Everybody's different. I picked on you twice today, and I'm really sorry. I'm very, very sorry. I won't say another word to you. But a lot of young people may pick up the book, but also may not. I went through this with a group of Holocaust survivors when we were deciding what would be the best way to tell their stories. And we decided it was the storytelling way as opposed to the book way. But there's no reason not to do both, right? So you can also sit and tell these stories. That's fabulous. Yes, ma'am.
So, when I hear you say that, and you talk about being like this, doing a video, making a recording the story, but the video with sound. Because that's the world.
Yes, well, that is an excellent point. That because this is the world we're living in, because grandparents and grandchildren aren't necessarily living that close where they can always share stories. In fact, my husband and I have done this for clients where we've sat somebody down and recorded them and asked and interviewed them and then given the thing to the family. And that's lovely. Again, that's storytelling. That is looking in their, you see their face, you hear their tone of voice, you hear how, so I'm not going to bother you. We hear how they say something, right? How they use their expressions. Are they smiling? You know that expression, smile, when you say that. Are they smiling when they say that? Things that you can't necessarily tell in writing, but a video will do that. Now, I will remind you that today a lot of people no longer have VCRs. The things that we did for our clients 20 years ago, we did on VHS tape, so they have to change the technology, and the technology keeps changing. When it comes to those 10 children telling a story to 10 children, telling a story to 10 children, we human beings have been telling stories since we were called human beings, right? And in fact, there's a great communication scholar, named Walter Fisher, often quoted, who said, we human beings are not only Homo sapiens, conscious thinking animal, but we are Homo narrans, a storytelling animal. That one of the most important things that separates us from other animals is our ability to see life as an overarching story, be able to understand the little stories that happen to in our lives, those beginning, middle, and ends, and the meaning associated with them. So as long as the stories are present, you are absolutely right that this is the world we live in, and there's a lot of good that comes out of that world. But when we're doing this, it's nice to also occasionally be able to do this as well. But I totally agree with you. Any last comments, thoughts, feelings? So thank you so much for your time. And, oh, yes, sir, last question.
Rather important for those that are interested. NPR, they have something called StoryCorps, and they are visiting cities all over the country and collecting stories and playing these on their network and storing these.
Thank you for bringing that up. StoryCorps was developed by the Library of Congress. Actually, it was developed by a man named David Isay, I-S-A-Y. And he started it as I believe he started, he's had one in New York and one in Washington. I can't remember where the first one is. The first one might have been in Washington, where people would go into a booth and record a 10-minute or something story about him, about themselves or about their family, or an oral history, right? It wasn't necessarily a story. We're now talking about the difference between the two. It could have been a description, it could have been facts, it could have been memories, etc. What happened was it became so popular that they put these kiosks, which is what they were, around a number of different places. They also would send out, I did this about 20 years ago, they would send out, or maybe more recently, because there was a DVD player and some DVDs, and I was able to record 4 people. I recorded a professor, I recorded some other people, and get their stories, and then send them back, and they have them on file in the Library of Congress. But NPR is also playing them. NPR plays The Moth, which is also, they didn't create it, but they play it, people telling their own stories. You may have heard the Moth Radio Hour. What is great about StoryCorps is for the purposes of NPR, they pull out the stories from the oral history. But StoryCorps is oral history. It's people telling what they remember about an incident, whether it's got cause and effect, whether it's got a shape or not. So if we're done, I just want to end by saying that your stories are precious. Your stories are what make you who you are. Your stories are what hold your families and our communities together. And by being here today, that tells me a whole lot about the rest of your story, right? Because you care about this subject. And I hope that you will have an extremely, not only successful time collecting and telling stories, but I hope you'll love the process because it is terrific. And I thank you so much for coming.